Did you know that this iconic scene in Jeepers Creepers is actually based on a true story? In 1980, Ray and his wife Marie were driving down a quiet road when a green van zoomed past them. A few minutes later, they would pass an old schoolhouse in the middle of nowhere. Sitting out front was that same green van, and next to it was a man trying to dispose of a bloody white sheet. They immediately sped off looking for a phone, but they didn't get far before the van appeared behind them once more. It followed them dangerously close for a few miles before taking a sudden turn. Ray and Marie then had a brave and arguably outright stupid idea. They decided to turn around and follow the truck in hopes of getting his license plate number. However, this time they found him parked on the side of the road changing his license plate, and they noticed that the interior of his car was covered with blood. They sped off once again and contacted the police. The man's name was Dennis Depew. Roughly 5 hours before Ray and Marie spotted him dumping the bloody sheet, Dennis got into a heated exchange with his wife Marilyn. This ended with Dennis pushing her down the stairs and hitting her, which was witnessed by all of their children. Dennis told them that he was going to take her to the hospital, but instead shot her and dumped the evidence.
Two men vanished nearly a year apart after renting the same shop in Silver Plume, Colorado. To make things even stranger, just 1 week after the first man's remains were finally found, the second man, who was writing a book about the case, supposedly set off on a hike with no proper gear and was never seen again. Tom Young was a former high school art teacher and retired U.S. Special Forces veteran living a quiet life in Silver Plume, Colorado with his dog Gus. He ran a bookstore on the town's main street and was for the most part quiet, and he kept to himself. But on September 7, 1987, Tom closed up his shop and with his dog Gus by his side was last seen walking into the mountains. After that, they vanished without a trace. When people finally realized that Tom was missing, they remembered him mentioning a possible trip to Europe. But when local boarding kennels were checked, a place where Tom would have left Gus if he'd gone on this trip, there was nothing. And there were no records of a plane ticket or any arrangements for this trip. Tom and Gus were inseparable, so wherever Tom went, Gus must have been with him. And it seemed like this is where the investigation stopped. Fast forward 9 months to June of 1988. Keith Reinhardt, a Chicago-based sports writer, was approaching his 50th birthday and found himself at a crossroads. Despite having a good job and being a married father, Keith couldn't shake the feeling that there was this void he needed to fill. Stress from work and daily life was taking its toll. He'd started gaining weight and felt an overwhelming need for change. Now, Keith had a friend named Ted Parker who owned the KP Cafe in the town of Silver Plume, Colorado. He often spoke of the town's slow pace and peaceful mountain life, which gave Keith an idea. Silver Plume seemed like the perfect place for him to go and reset. He told his wife that he wanted to spend some time there to work on a novel, clear his mind, and with the mountains close by, Keith felt that he could finally focus on his health and maybe overcome his fear of heights. At first, his wife wasn't entirely sold on the idea, but Keith's determination won her over, and he assured her that she could join him later if she wanted. With that, Keith took a 3-month leave from work and set off for Silver Plume. Once there, he rented a vacant shop from his buddy Ted, who also owned the cafe next door. He found an apartment at the back of the church and quickly settled into his new routine. He was selling antiques and matted photographs in his shop while dedicating himself to finally writing this novel. But it didn't take long for writer's block to set in, and Keith began struggling to make progress. So he started taking regular walks into the nearby mountains despite his fear of heights and the anxiety it brought him, but he hoped the fresh air and the time outdoors might spark some inspiration. Then, one day, it finally did. Keith learned that the previous tenant of the shop he was renting, a man named Tom Young, had mysteriously disappeared with his dog Gus. The story immediately grabbed his attention, and he felt it was the perfect inspiration for his novel, so he began diving into Tom's case, talking to locals, and meticulously documenting their conversations. The novel Keith began writing was heavily inspired by Tom's life and disappearance, and it centered around a character named Guy Gypsum who had a lot of similarities to both Tom and Keith himself. But what started as simple research became an obsession. Keith couldn't shake the feeling that something about this wasn't right. About a month after Keith arrived in Silver Plume, on January 31st, 1988, local hunters made a disturbing discovery in the mountains. They found a human skull propped against a tree. They found a backpack, a pistol, and the skeletal remains of a dog. It was Tom Young and his dog, Gus. Investigators learned that Tom had purchased a pistol just 4 days before he vanished, and they quickly ruled it a suicide, but not everyone was convinced. A tarp had been pulled over Tom's remains almost as if to conceal them. And some have said that police never actually confirmed if the gun found at the scene was the gun used on both Tom and Gus. Whether that's the truth or just speculation, police stuck with their ruling, but the townspeople had other theories. An auto mechanic had witnessed several large trucks driving up a dead-end road road near his house, and he believed these trucks were carrying nuclear waste from a weapons plant, and they were illegally dumping the waste into an abandoned mine shaft. The mechanic only ever shared his suspicions with two people, a writer named Sarah and Tom Young. Rumors began to circulate that Tom might have discovered too much or planned to expose the illegal dumping, and that it might have cost him his life. On August 3rd, Keith attended Tom Young's memorial service, and just a few days later, on the evening of August 6th, he went to a party at the KP building hosted by a Denver radio station. Throughout the night, Keith was seen talking with a woman and sharing his thoughts with other partygoers. He told several people that he was convinced Tom Young did not take his own life. The next day, August 7th, Keith closed up his shop around 4 or 5 p.m. and walked over to Ted's cafe. He told Ted that he planned to hike up Pendleton Mountain and would be back by 10 p.m. At first, Ted thought Keith was joking. The hike was about 6 hours round trip, and Keith had already attempted it before but failed due to his fear of heights. On top of that, Keith wasn't wearing appropriate hiking gear. But Keith wasn't joking. He insisted that this time he would make it to the top of the mountain and told Ted, if I'm not back by 10 p.m., call the rescue team. That was the last time anyone saw or heard from Keith. When he didn't return, Ted reported him missing, and the Colorado Alpine Rescue Team launched one of the largest search and rescue missions in the state's history at that time. They scoured Pendleton Mountain as well as 2 other nearby mountains with ground teams, planes, helicopters, and search dogs. Unfortunately, nothing was found, and the search was called off when a Civil Air Patrol plane crashed into Pendleton Mountain, killing the pilot Terry Leedens and seriously injuring the spotter Don Drobny. The only trace of Keith was a piece from his book, which eerily mirrored the events of his last known movements. This section, which many people believe to be the ending of the book, said, quote, Guy Gypsum changed into some hiking boots and donned a heavy flannel shirt. He understood it all now and his motivation. Guy closed the door, then walked off towards the lush, shadowless Colorado forest above. End quote. Over the years, many theories have emerged about Keith's disappearance. Some believe he may have died from exposure in the mountains or possibly taken his own life, but his family was not convinced that he would have taken his life. Others suggest foul play may have been involved. Keith vanished just 1 week after Tom's remains were discovered, and his son has publicly stated that he believes his father's disappearance was no accident. He said he felt his dad and possibly Tom Young may have stumbled upon something they weren't supposed to, and it cost them their lives. To this day, Keith Reinhardt's case remains unsolved, and it is still open.
This is one of the most unbelievable and heartbreaking cases I have ever covered, and it took over 13 years to solve. I'm True Crime Caitlin, and this is the murder of Dorothy Donovan. In 1991, Dorothy Mae Donovan was 70 years old. She was a beloved mother of 4 and a very hands-on grandmother. One of her favourite things to do was babysit the grandkids, and when she wasn't doing that, she was tending to her garden, growing her own vegetables, or going to church. She was a vibrant and energetic woman who had so much love to put out into the world. After being widowed for a second time, Dorothy lived alone in a farmhouse on her 163-acre property nearby Harrington in Delaware. Despite living alone in the farmhouse, she wasn't alone on the property. Her son Charles, who was 41 at the time of this case, lived on a trailer in the property, and it was literally a stone's throw away. Their front doors were about 60 yards apart, which is about just over half of the size of a football field. So they lived really close by. The 23rd of June 1991 was starting off as normal as any other morning. Charles had just finished a shift at a local factory at around about 12:30 a.m. when he stopped at a Hardee's fast food restaurant to pick up a burger and a coffee for the travel home. As he walked through the parking lot into his truck and started to drive off, he noticed a man standing at his driver's side window. Charles rolled down the window to hear that this man was asking him for a lift. Charles hooed and hawed a little bit. It was really late. It was getting on to about 1 in the morning now, and he knew that his mum Dorothy back at home didn't go to sleep until she knew that he was home. No matter how old your kids are, they're still your kids. And frankly, he had just finished working a long tiring shift and he just wanted to get home. He told this man, the hitchhiker, that no, he couldn't give him a lift, but this hitchhiker was very persistent. He was telling Charles that he desperately needed to get to a nearby hospital because his sister had just given birth. Reluctantly, Charles agreed and told this man that he would drive him part of the way. He would drop him off at a certain junction. That was as far as he was going to take him. It was getting too late and he wasn't going to be going out of his way. Seemingly happy with this, the man jumped inside of the truck and off they drove. A couple of miles down the road, Charles arrived at the junction that he said he would drop this man off. He pulled over and and expected the man to get out, but he wouldn't. Charles firmly reminded the man of their agreement that he wasn't going to be taking him any further and that he needed to get out, and this seemingly flipped a switch inside of the man's mind, who became aggressive and violent. The hitchhiker raised his fist and punched Charles directly in the face, now threatening him and demanding him to give him the keys to the truck and to give him his money. As he's screaming at Charles, he's also threatening him with one of Charles's own screwdrivers that just happened to be inside of the truck. Charles would pull the keys out of the ignition as he fled the truck and raced to a nearby garage for help. He brayed on the windows, pleading for someone inside to help him, but inside was empty. There was no one coming to help. Realising that Charles had taken off with the keys, the hitchhiker, this strange crazed man, began to chase after him, waving around the screwdriver, and he began threatening Charles, saying, "I am going to kill you, I am going to kill you right now." Charles told the man that he didn't want any trouble, and if he just calmed down, he would drive him anywhere that he wanted. The men walked back towards the truck together, and just as they got to the truck, thinking fast, Charles jumped inside, locked the doors, started the truck and drove away, leaving the man behind. He drove in the opposite direction to his home to ensure that this crazed man wouldn't follow him. After waiting a short while and realising that the man thankfully hadn't followed him, Charles breathed a sigh of relief before making his way back home, only to be stunned when he arrived there because there was the man at his trailer. Charles spun around and raced to a nearby payphone, calling 911 at 1:19 a.m. Despite how frantic Charles was on the phone, the operator listed it as low priority and an officer wouldn't meet with Charles until 3 a.m. The officer escorted him back to his trailer, and when they arrived, they saw that nothing seemed up. Hadn't been robbed or burgled, broken into, nothing like that. The trailer was exactly as Charles had left it. Charles asked the officer to come with him to check on his mother Dorothy, and he would later say that as soon as he opened the door, he knew that something was wrong. When he called out for Dorothy and heard no answer, a shiver went down his spine, because Dorothy always waited up for Charles to get in from work before going to sleep, and her not calling back to him was completely out of the ordinary. Sadly, it would be Charles that would discover the body of his 70-year-old mother, Dorothy Donovan. She had been ferociously stabbed at least 24 times all across her face, her arm, and her chest, and unbelievably, the murder weapon was the screwdriver that the man had stolen from Charles's truck. Aside from the body of Dorothy, nothing else inside of the farmhouse seemed out of place. There was no sign of SA on Dorothy's body, there was no sign of burglary, and no sign of a struggle. This seemed like a random attack. Initially, the police suspected Charles was their main suspect. They found it very hard to believe that he had finished work, picked up a random man, dropped this man off miles away from his home, was attacked by him, managed to get away, and somehow this stranger still managed to find himself at Charles's home, at the home of his mother, to go in and just randomly kill her. They learned that shortly before Dorothy's murder, her life insurance had been upped, and currently Charles was having some financial issues. His description of the hitchhiker was also very vague. He described him as a young black man, and based off of his description, this composite sketch was made. During their investigation though, police were able to corroborate every single thing that Charles claimed. Other witnesses at the Harvey's fast food restaurant would recall seeing the young black man asking different people for lifts, and some of them even saw him getting into Charles's truck. Another witness would recall driving along and actually seeing Charles being chased by a young black man. Charles also had injuries consistent with his story. He claimed to have been punched in the face by this man, and he did have markings to his face. He also had burns on his wrists where he had spilt his coffee on himself during the altercation. Most importantly, however, crime scene investigators would discover a bloody palm print on the banister inside of the farmhouse. From this bloody palm print, they were able to extract DNA, and this DNA did not match Charles. And so he was eliminated as a suspect, and sadly, the murder investigation began to go cold. The big break in the case wouldn't come until 13 years later in 2004, when the DNA from the crime scene was added into CODIS, a new national DNA database. And it wouldn't be until November 2005 that finally they got a match. The DNA belonged to a now 41-year-old man named Gilbert Cannon. He had been incarcerated several times across the past few years for things including burglary, robbery, theft, resisting arrest, disorderly conduct, and escape. He was released from prison in 2004, and as standard protocol, his DNA was taken and then added onto the CODIS database, and that is how we ended up getting the match. He was arrested on the 18th of January 2006 while at his girlfriend's house. Initially, he denied any sort of involvement in the murder whatsoever. However, when he was presented with the evidence, he would confess. His confession matched up perfectly with Charles's version of events as well. Gilbert claimed that on the night of the murder, he was high and he was looking to score more drugs. He said that after Charles had took off in the truck, leaving him behind, he just started walking, looking for a house to break into to sleep in. He was just walking along and looking for a house that didn't look like it had anyone in. And the first house that he came across that had no lights on inside was that of Dorothy Donovan. It was a totally random selection. He had no idea that Dorothy was the mother of Charles. When he broke inside, he was shocked to see that Dorothy was still awake and scared that she would be able to report him to the police and identify him. He killed her with the only weapon that he had on his person, the screwdriver he had stolen from Charles's truck. As bizarre as it sounds, this was all just a sickening, horrific coincidence. Gilbert Cannon would plead guilty to the murder of Dorothy Donovan. He was handed a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole.
When her dad went to work one morning, this little girl vanished with nothing but a swimsuit and a towel. What happened to Trudy Appleby? It was 1996 in Moline in Illinois. Trudy Appleby was just 11 years old. She was last spotted in the driveway of her home in East Moline on the 21st of August 1996. It was roughly between 9:30 and 10 in the morning. Now, Trudy's dad had left the home roughly about half an hour earlier to go to work. It was a neighbour who made the last known sighting of the little girl. They saw her getting into a grey four-door car with a white male who was wearing a baseball cap. When Trudy's dad arrived home later on that day, he was alarmed to find his child was nowhere to be seen. He immediately called police and the hunt was on. Now, Trudy had apparently not been forced into the vehicle by the looks of things, but seemingly took a swimsuit and towel with her in a bag. It's believed she had asked her dad that morning if she could go swimming and he said no. Now, her home wasn't visible to a busy road or anything like that, so is it possible that the abductor made plans to pick her up? She left roughly $200 in savings behind, which leads investigators to believe that she didn't intentionally run away. So who were the suspects in this case? One of Trudy's dad's friends called Ed Smith was certainly a very likely suspect. He became prime suspect in 2017, years and years later. His son-in-law, David Whipple, lived across the road from Trudy. Ed was obviously familiar with Trudy due to knowing her dad. He would also potentially know that her dad was due to go to work that day. A witness at the time, which reportedly was that David Whipple, had seen Trudy in Ed Smith's car, and he said Ed had threatened to kill him if he told anyone. He also very suspiciously had his car scrapped less than a week after Trudy had vanished. This could very well have been him trying to conceal evidence. However, some theorise that this witness, David Whipple, could have been involved. Disturbingly, he was a registered S offender. As this happened in the early 90s, Ed Smith had actually since passed away. Some think David may have been involved in some way and used Ed as a bit of a scapegoat after he died. He had tellingly refused to cooperate with police immediately after Trudy's disappearance. Now, the Charlie Project website does state that Trudy's dad believes that Ed and David may both be involved. Could they have taken her out on a boat trip, hence the swimming costume? Now, Trudy was apparently friends with one of David's kids, and they would regularly go out on a boat together. Then in 2020, a third person of interest was identified. This was Jamie Fisher. Now, again, he was involved with Ed Smith. He was a friend of the family, and investigators wonder whether Jamie had helped cover something up. In May 2021, Jamie was given 2 years in prison after stealing a car. He may be released in 2026. Frustratingly, David Whipple died in August 2022, aged 61. Tragically, Trudy's case remains unsolved. This is one of the most horrific cases I've heard recently, so please be warned before watching. 29-year-old Taylor Parker has just been sentenced to death for a crime so horrendous that I can't believe a human is capable of this. Regan Simmons Hancock and Taylor had met online. Their online friendship soon blossomed into a real-life connection. It was 2022 and Regan was married with a young daughter. She was also 8 months pregnant at this time. Taylor was also pregnant, or so it would seem to the outside world. She was posting pregnancy pictures on social media and even hosted a gender reveal party. Little did her loved ones know that she was actually staging the entire thing. Regan and Taylor were really good friends around this time and they were bonding over their pregnancies. Regan even shared a Facebook status thanking Taylor for bringing her round a gift and Starbucks. This was the day before she would be murdered by Taylor. On Taylor's supposed due date, she made her way round to Regan's house in Texas. Shortly after, Regan's mum made a horrifying discovery. Her daughter was face down on the floor, deceased with blood everywhere. Her mum rang the emergency services and they raced to the scene. It became apparent that her baby had been, and again a massive trigger warning here, ripped out of her stomach, and Regan had been stabbed over 100 times. Meanwhile, Taylor was pulled over for speeding and driving erratically. She'd actually put the baby in her lap with the umbilical cord coming out of her trousers to make it seem like she'd just given birth. When the pair were taken to hospital, the horrors of what actually happened became apparent. The newborn baby tragically passed away and Taylor was arrested. She was sentenced to death, but her defense lawyer said that her loved ones should have done more to protect her earlier on when she was pretending to be pregnant.
Naomi Smith, she was a 15-year-old schoolgirl. She left her house to do a favor for her mother, but she would never be seen again. I hate having to say this warning, I really do. It hurts me in my heart, but have to. This case does involve a child, a 15-year-old child. So if you think that listening to a case like this can harm your mental health, please take care of yourself. Your mental health is and always has been the most important thing. So skip the video if you have to. Take care of yourselves. Love you. Naomi was the baby of her family. Her family consisted of her mother, Catherine, her father, Brian, and her 3 older brothers. The family lived, and I think you pronounce it Nuneaton. It's in England. Correct me if I'm wrong. But Naomi has been described to be a very sweet girl. She was quite reserved. At the time of this case, she was 15 years old and she was in high school. September 14th, 1995, it was a Thursday. Naomi was home with her parents when her mother asked if she could drop off a letter at a post box near the house. It was only 0 miles away from the house, very close. Naomi said yes, of course, she would be happy to help out her mom. She left the house around 9:35 p.m. The errand should not have taken her more than 5 to 10 minutes, if that. But when she should have been home, she wasn't, and her parents figured she probably ran into a neighbor or friend, probably stopped to chat. They didn't fear the worst yet. That was until it started getting really dark outside. It was getting late. Now we were over the 1 hour mark of Naomi having left the house, and the concern started to set in for her parents. Naomi's father, Brian, he got in his car. He was going to drive around to see if he could find her. He checked the neighborhood. She wasn't there. He checked near the post box. She wasn't there. He drove over to Naomi's best friend's house, which is the only other place that he could think that Naomi could be at, but she wasn't there. Brian doesn't know what to do now. It's after 11 p.m. It's nearing midnight. He's in his vehicle with Naomi's best friend, Emma, who wanted to join in on the search, and they drive towards a nearby park. It was like a local rec center, a local park, and as they were getting closer, they noticed that there was something underneath the slide of the playground. The closer that Brian got, the quicker he realized his worst nightmare was about to come true. 15-year-old Naomi Smith's body was found underneath the slide. She had a major slash across her neck. Blood was covering her entire body, and it was clear that she was no longer alive. Police got there as fast as they could, and sadly they knew as well as soon as they saw her that she was no longer alive. It was too late. Naomi Smith was sadly pronounced dead at the scene. The damage to her body was visible, the wound to her throat cut so deep, and she had a bite mark on her chest, but the autopsy later revealed that that was not the only thing her attacker had done to her, because Naomi had also been violently SA'd. By the next day, Friday, September 15th, approximately 30 officers were sent out to the crime scene to start looking for any signs or gathering anything that they could that could become evidence, but it would prove to be a hard investigation because they didn't really have anything to go off. They didn't have any witnesses of people of interest so far. No murder weapon had been found, and on top of that, the weather was not on their side. It had been raining consistently the days following the murder, probably wiping away any blood blood or any footprints or any evidence of that sort. The next tactic they chose to take was to retrace Naomi's steps up the day of the murder. We know that she had been with her best friend Emma. Earlier in the day, we know that she was dropped off at home. We know that she was home with her parents around 9:30 to 9:40. We know that she left because her mother asked her to drop off the letter. We know that she did drop off the letter. But how did she end up at the park? How did she get there? And how did she get attacked in such a brutal manner, seemingly out of nowhere? In the following days, police held a lot of public appeals. In some of those appeals, with the parents' permission, they did describe the nature of Naomi's injuries. One of the detectives said, quote, "I believe that it's right and proper to reveal the extent of Naomi's injuries so that those who may have mixed loyalties about whether to come forward with information do so," end quote. Police got a lead from a local resident that said that they had seen a group of 5 teenage boys around the area the night of the murder, and law enforcement put together this very planned plan to arrest those 5 boys to be able to question them, and they did, and they arrested them, and they did speak to them for hours. But even after talking to them, they had nothing, no new information, and eventually they had to let the 5 boys go. After they let the 5 boys go, some test results from the crime scene started to come back. A very important test that they had done was on the bite mark that was found on Naomi's chest, and that showed that there was some male DNA from saliva left on that bite mark. They didn't know who the DNA belonged to, but now they could rule out who they knew that it didn't belong to. Law enforcement basically began gathering groups of local men around the ages of 15 to 28. They wanted to take their DNA to test it against the DNA that they did have. And what do you know? They got a match to 19-year-old Edwin Hopkins. Edwin lived close to Naomi, and when looking into him, officers found that something about Edwin was that he had an obsession with knives. Not only that, but we also later learned that he had previously been accused of attempting to attack a female at that same local park where Naomi's body was found. And in that previous attack, Edwin had also bit the victim's chest. Luckily, that victim was able to get away, but what a strong similarity. So he's known to be an aggressive person. We know that he has access to weapons, and he knows the neighborhood. Most importantly, he knows that specific park where the crime scene was, where the crime took place, and also just happened to be the same park where he had previously attempted to try and attack a different female. 19-year-old Edwin Hopkins is now the prime suspect. Police go question him. They ask him what he was up to the night of the murder. He says that he was home that night with his sister. He says he left the house for around 15 minutes or so to walk to the store to get candy for the both of them, but that he was back home by 9:45, and he just said he hung out with his sister for the rest of the night. Police go talk to the sister, who also says that this is true. However, she was lying. We know that because she herself went back to the police station and she said, "I have lied. My brother was not only gone for 15 minutes, he was gone for almost an entire hour." She also says that when he returned home, he was wearing an entirely different outfit. He left the house with an outfit on, he was gone for an hour, and he came back wearing completely different clothes. I don't know, but I don't think that his sister meant to lie. I think she was just going along with what her brother was saying. But when she learned about Naomi Smith, she heard what happened, she heard what time she was killed and where she was killed. I think that something clicked in her brain, and she thought, oh, my brother could have done this. I should probably tell police the truth. The last thing that the cops needed to seal Edwin's fate were his dental records, and they got a hold of those. They compared them to the bite mark on Naomi's chest, and to no surprise, it was an exact match. And with that, Edwin Hopkins was arrested and charged with the murder of 15-year-old Naomi Smith. In trial, he pled not guilty. But obviously, on January 30th of 1997, he was found guilty. I mean, obviously, it was hard to deny. All the evidence was strong evidence, and it all pointed to him. He was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. To this day, Edwin Hopkins has always maintained his innocence regarding the murder. He says that he didn't do it, he doesn't know anything about it, and he has never confessed, which is so infuriating. And get this, Edwin was released in December of 2023, last year, after almost 27 years in prison, but he didn't even last a month. 23 days after getting released, he was sent back to prison. I couldn't find exactly why, but it sounds like he broke a condition or a rule that he was supposed to follow after his release. I don't know what that rule was that he broke, but a probation service member has said, quote, "Protecting the public is our #1 priority. That's why we set tough conditions, and when offenders breach them, we don't hesitate to return them back to custody." Anyway, back to Naomi. Her funeral was held on December 18th of 1995. It was at a church, and she was in a white coffin decorated with beautiful, beautiful flowers. I can't say for sure, obviously, but I really, really hope that her mother didn't blame herself for what happened to Naomi. I mean, I can't even imagine. But she didn't know. Obviously, there was no way that anyone could have ever known what was going to happen to her, or that there was such an evil person out that night looking to attack and do terrible, terrible things. There was no way that anyone could have known. I hope that the family was able to lay her to rest and find some peace, some way, somehow.